Observation 1. In 1982, a strange species of algae native to the Caribbean arrived at the Oceanographic Museum of Monaco. Research headquarters Jacques Cousteau and other famous marine biologists. Once this weed cultivated for its appearance, slipped into the wild, a catastrophe began to occur. In less than 20 years, a single square meter of Ecological foliage spread 6,000 hectares. Its highly toxic attributes devastating surrounding marine life and permanently damaging ocean biodiversity. The resilient seaweed has spread throughout the Mediterranean, parts of the Atlantic, along the Australian coastline, and now to the Pacific coast of the United States. Something must be done and fast. Gibb, 2001. Ecological foliage does not wither, grows with astounding vigor, resists cool water temperatures, and serves as a secondary food source for forest tropical fishes. This is how it arrived at the Oceanographic Museum of Monaco, where it was cultivated beginning in 1982. 2 years later, the algae was discovered in nature. At that time, a beautiful stranger occupied only a square meter of Mediterranean bottom. 6 years later, the algae was noted on the French coast 5 kilometers from Monaco. Its detrimental impact on coastal ecosystems was deplored. The algae grows everywhere, from the surface to the lower limits of underwater vegetation. It grows as well in front of the Cape swelled by storms and currents as on soft bottoms of sheltered bays, on polluted mud of harbors as on stretches of the bottom with diverse flora and fauna. Highly toxic and barely injurious herbivores, they are not hindered to spread. It is thus growing unrestrained, covering and then eliminating many plant and animal species. Currently, Ecological foliage spreads unchecked over large areas in the Mediterranean. The species, which is inedible with fish and marine invertebrates, spreads even on the southern Australian coast and devastates these inshore fisheries and ecosystems as well. The recent discovery of the marine green algae Ecological foliage on the Californian coast has raised public concern about the potential danger of a new invasion similar to the one endured by the Mediterranean. A small colony spread of more than 6,000 hectares today, outcompeting native species, is seriously reducing diversity in the areas of the northwestern Mediterranean, and the invasion keeps still expanding at a rapid pace. After having selected it for aquaria from numerous imported algal species, and after having dumped it into the sea, humans fostered dissemination in nature. Yacht anchors and fishing gear carried it from anchorage to anchorage and from harbor to harbor, sometimes over great distances. Dissemination essentially takes place by fragmentation. The spatially isolated appearance of Ecological foliage colonies are mediated by human effort, i.e. transported by the anchoring systems of private vessels or the fishing gear of commercially operated enterprises. At any given site, the seaweed covers all favorable available substrates, including rock, sand, mud, and natural meadows. This algae can cover up to 100% of the sea bottom from 1 to 35 meters. The expansion of this invading species continues. Thus, the plan. In order to substantially increase the protection of marine natural resources, the United States federal government, through the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, should establish an ocean policy by deploying yearly Elysia subordinata sea slug treatments to oceanic areas affected with chloroprotectifolia, the algae. Funding and enforcement guaranteed will clarify intent. Observation 2, solvency. Our plan is the only hope. Chloroprotectifolia causes economic and ecological devastation. Current efforts can't solve. They're costly, ineffective, and kill native species. Sheehan, 2002. An invasive green algae dubbed killer algae, Chloroprotectifolia, was discovered in the waters of Southern California in early 2000. Native to tropical waters become popular in the aquarium trade in the late 1970s and either escaped or was released into the Mediterranean Sea in the mid-1980s. It is now widespread throughout much of the northwestern Mediterranean. It appears that the algae found off Southern California is a clone of the released Mediterranean plant and growing deeper in colder waters than in tropical populations. The impacts have been compared to the unrolling of carpet of astroturf across the seabed. In areas where it has become well established, it has caused economic and ecological devastation by overgrowing and eliminating native seaweed, seagrass reefs, and other communities. Efforts to destroy a single patch of algae in Southern California have involved tarping off the affected area and injecting chlorine into the tarp. Even with this drastic and costly effort, which has killed virtually everything under the tarp, the algae is still not completely gone. Next, the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force has the authority and the resources to destroy killer algae. Sheehan, 2002. NISA sets up a National Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force and regional panels. The NSTF provides an important support role that includes ways to deal with intentional introductions. Regional panels identify regional priorities, share and disseminate information, conduct outreach, and make recommendations to report to the National Task Force. Though much of the NISA focuses on ballast water, it also addresses non-ballast vectors. It gives the ANSTF general authority to research, monitor, and take coordinated actions to prevent introductions of aquatic invasive species. It addresses construction to reduce the invasive species dispersal. Appropriations provide annual funding for programs. Programs funded include enforcement of aquatic nuisance species management plans. Next, our slug solves best is the most effective way to eliminate the algae and it will die in the winter. Topicality, 2000. Only the unshelled species, Elysia subordinata, is able to store the algal chloroplasts and to keep them functional. Among the 4 species, the tropical Elysia subordinata seems to be the best candidate as an agent of a biological role of chloroprotectifolia. Indeed, the species has a direct bed development, allowing it to quickly establish locally dense populations and has the highest feeding rate of chloroprotectifolia. Lastly, Elysia subordinata dies at temperatures lower than 15 degrees Celsius. Advantage 1, biodiversity. Invasive species threaten 400 endangered species and the entire ecosystem. Mental 99. Estimating the full extent of the environmental damages caused by exotic species and the number of species extinctions they have caused is difficult because little is known about the estimated 750,000 species in the United States, half of which have not even been described. Nonetheless, about 958 species that are listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act are considered to be at risk primarily because of competition with and predation by non-indigenous species. In other regions of the world, as many as 80% of the endangered species are threatened due to the pressures of non-native species. Many other species worldwide they're not listed are also negatively affected by alien species and or ecosystem changes caused by alien species. Estimating the economic impacts associated with non-indigenous species in the United States is also difficult. Nevertheless, enough data are available to quantify some of the impacts on agricultural, forestry, and public health. Next, if left unchecked, this highly toxic and resilient killer algae will eventually blanket the entire seabed, catastrophically altering marine biodiversity. Yip, 2001. Chloroprotectifolia demonstrated all the following characteristics on mass: dominance, toxicity, occupation of all sublittoral biotopes, absence or scarcity of real predators, longevity, and absence of any seasonal repose. The extraordinary invasive capacity of this species is based on broad ecological amplitude, rapid and efficient growth as well as spread, and aggressive strategy towards competitors. The algae adapts to any mold, be it a polluted port or a clean isolated bay. It can resist hard winters and shows vigority and intensity not present in species found in tropical seas. The vigorous, quasi-permanent, thick vegetable coverage achieved by Chloroprotectifolia easily covers the depth range from 5 to 30 meters. Occasionally, the seaweed has been sighted at depths of even 100 meters. Chloroprotectifolia occupies almost any substrate, thus wiping out other macroalgal competitors. It destroys Posidonia meadows, which play an essential role in the Mediterranean. They bolster and protect the coastline and act as a refuge, habitat, spawning ground, and nursery for a countless number of species. The algae secretes various toxins such as chlorpidine, which is not toxic to humans, but is toxic to mollusks, sea urchins, herbivores, fishes, and other submarine flora. In one experiment, sea urchins ate their own waste and resorted to pieces of plastic rather than touching the seaweed. This means that the algae is safe from the predators. Within Chloroprotectifolia populations, there is a significant decrease in species diversity and fish biomass when compared with the Posidonia beds. Therefore, the coastal ecosystem is clearly under threat, which could result in total uniformization of underwater populations and landscapes. Advantage 2, U.S. environmental leadership. The United States must accept a leadership role internationally to prevent invasive species outbreaks. National Invasive Species Council, 2001. The U.S. cannot succeed in addressing its domestic invasive species problem unless it takes a leadership role in international cooperation and invests in strategies that raise the capacity of other nations to manage the movement of invasive species. Our ability to prevent invasive species from entering the U.S. depends a great deal on the capability of other countries to effectively manage invasive species and invasive pathways domestically. Once invasive species become established within one country, they pose a threat to an entire region as well as its trading partners in every country along the trading pathway. If an invasive species never leaves its native country, it will never become a problem in the U.S. Actions by the U.S. have sometimes contributed to the invasive species problem faced by other countries. Despite good intentions, we occasionally facilitate the introduction of invasive species to other countries through development assistance programs, military operations, family relief projects, and international financing. Next, the U.S. must promote international invasive species control efforts to limit their spread. National Invasive Species Council, 2001. Clearly, the U.S. needs to promote international consistency and adequate standards and policies to prevent and control the spread of invasive species. Governments and international organizations are using conventions, treaties, and other international agreements to raise awareness of the invasive species issue and take coordinated steps to establish prevention and control policies. These range from trade-related agreements that play a significant role in the regulation of invasive pathways to agreements focused on the protection of specific ecosystems. These efforts need to be strengthened and expanded. The U.S. also needs to encourage industry and other sectors to adopt codes of conduct, thus setting voluntary standards to help limit the spread of invasive species. Next, only the U.S. can solve the world's best and only hope. Brand 2003. Step aside, NATO. South Florida sea slug is being enlisted to defend European waters from a toxic algae invasion. The Algae subordinata slug, native to Florida's grassy shallows, is considered by several European scientists their brightest hope for slowing the spread of a fern-like algae that has carpeted parts of the Mediterranean Sea. The slug eats the algae and nothing else, said Alexander Menes, a marine biologist at the University of Nice, Sophia, and Topicality in France, and author of Killer Algae. It is our best chance. We must work on these Florida slugs seriously and test many strains. The invasive strain of algae, Chloroprotectifolia, is believed to have originated in the Pacific Ocean. It first appeared in Europe and off the coast of Monaco in 1904 and was probably released. Do you want me to finish my sentence? No? All right, that's cool.
Okay, exactly how are you enforcing the plan?
The Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force is going to take the slugs and put them in the ocean where Chloroprotectifolia is.
Okay, and what's your plan?
The plan is to take the Algae subordinata and put it where Chloroprotectifolia is and let it eat the Chloroprotectifolia until it's dead.
Okay, so they eat the algae?
Yes.
Okay, and how much of this algae, like how far has it actually spread?
Well, in here it talks about how it covered 6,000 hectares after 5 years, but right now we actually have a card that says it covers 32,000 acres of the Mediterranean, and it's also in California and on the Australian coastline.
Okay, and so the slugs themselves, where are the slugs found?
Where the slugs found? Up to 10 miles off the coast of the Florida coastline.
Okay, so, okay, let's see. On your Advantage 2, how do you claim to solve internationally?
Well, the Advantage 2 talks about how there's a leadership void right now on the environmental problems, and America is the only country in the position to step into that void and to take control, I guess you would say, as the leader of the environmental, of anybody that's trying to solve environmental problems.
Okay, but how does the United States take the lead if it's just a national policy?
Because it addresses the problem directly. It doesn't worry about it. It just takes a step towards addressing the problem.
Okay, but it just addresses a national policy. How is that an international legal
It's not
issue?
just a national problem. Chloroprotectifolia threatens the entire ocean.
Okay, so do you claim to solve for other countries?
We claim to solve for Chloroprotectifolia across the ocean, yes.
So you solve outside of U.S. jurisdiction?
Outside of the EEZs, yes.
How do you do this?
We put the slugs in the water where Chloroprotectifolia is.
Okay, so do you just put them in the United States waters, or do you put them
No, we
elsewhere?
put them wherever chlorprotect exfoliate is.
Okay. Let's see. Let's see. Right before you're done, it's one of the very last card. It says the most effective way to solve, and then what?
On here? Talks about how the Florida sea slugs are the most effective way to solve. What do you mean it would say after that?
Okay, I thought it said something else. Why are they the most effective way to solve?
Because the problem with with biological control for algae usually is that the slug will go through and eat it and break it into two different parts, and then the algae will grow doubly as fast. But this slug is called a vampire slug because it sucks the chloroplasts out of the algae, and it never really breaks the algae into two pieces. So it can no longer reproduce and spread, but and then it dies. It's like it leaves it as a skeleton. So it's really the only way to solve for it. So
Okay, and where
spread
was this
out more.
tested? Like, when was it tested?
Alexander Venus, actually, the biologist, it talks about it throughout the case, but specifically right here in the brand evidence, it talks about Alexander Venus. He's the one that tested it and made sure it worked.
Okay, and what are the current policies towards the algae?
Towards the algae, in California, they have tried chlorine, but it didn't work, and current policy is.
Can I see how big this is?
Yeah.
We'll take
That-
some.
Can we get that back before my speech?
Actually, can you start prep program real quick? Okay, hit prep. I'm sorry, start it one more time. I'm good for all this time. How much was used?
Not sure.
I'm going pour off and then onto arms. And then solvency. So everybody ready? A interpretation. Natural jurisdiction extends 200 miles from the shore. Sovereign rights exist throughout the 200-mile EEZ zone. This is Craig in 2002. Current U.S. ocean regulation arbitrarily fragments marine resources geographically, ignoring ecosystem connections. Part of this geographic fragmentation reflects international law, which recognizes several zones in the United States and gives coastal nations varying degrees of the regulatory authority over those zones. The 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which came into force in 1994, established several zones of national regulatory control over the sea. The 12 miles of ocean closest to shore are a coastal nation's territorial sea, where the coastal nation exerts sovereign control over the waters, the airspace, the seabed, and the soil. B, violation. The affirmative team acts internationally, thus violating U.S. jurisdiction. And C, standards and voters. For reasons of education, first of all, they decrease in the education of the round by not being topical. And second of all, for reasons of fairness, they must be topical in this debate in order for us to. In order for it to provide for a debate. And 3, ground. It takes away from the negative ground by them being without it. And fourth of all, in round abuse, we have absolutely no on-case. We're not going to have any specific on-case arguments to their case because they are untopical. And D, topicality is a voter for reasons of tradition. Traditionally, topicality has been a voting issue, and for reasons of jurisdiction, you as a judge have the ability to vote them off because they're untopical. And next, a uniqueness. Japan is an ocean leader in New Technology Week in 2002. It's been at least a decade since the United States had to worry about Japan overtaking U.S. technological leadership. But that's just what's happening today. As the Japanese supercomputer appears to be outperforming the highest end of U.S. machines, that situation has prompted a lot of soul searching within the high performance. Situations promptly a lot of soul searching within the high performance computing community will likely translate to important changes in the direction of U.S. supercomputing, according to federal officials and others. And B, link. Influence is zero sum. The plan upstages Japan. This is Panda in 91. Because of the lack of appreciation of others' point of view, the Japanese are continuously surprised at others' negative reactions to Japan's actions. In their relationship with the rest of the world, most Japanese view life in the world as a zero-sum game, one in which there are only winners and losers. The notion that life can be, and most of the time, is a positive-sum game in which both or all parties that meets with great skepticism from members of the Japanese establishment. If one accepts a zero-sum game view of the world, one naturally wants to be a winner. At all times and all circumstances, if a country cannot share winning, that country is generally not appreciated. This reaction is not Japan bashing racism. It is a reaction to take-all attitude as characterized Japan's worldview. And see internal link. Loss of soft power triggers militarism. This is 9 in 94. After all, a more independent Japan will follow its own interests, which will sometimes conflict with U.S. interests. Moreover, the U.S. is the world's only superpower, and Japan, to a considerable extent, remains dependent from U.S. choice of accommodating or resisting the rise of Japanese power. Channeling Japanese power into global institutions seems far more likely to produce stability in East Asia and reduce the friction of the U.S.-Japanese relationship, as Japan seems to resent the dependent relationship. And impact. 1. Japanese operate Asian proliferation. This is U.S. News and World 2003. Faced with the nuclear breakout by a hostile regime, Japan reconsiders its anti-nuclear type, a larger missile force of its own, and plunges into developing a shield against incoming missiles with the United States. South Korea, with one eye on the north and other in Japan, follows suit. China reacts with more nukes and missiles of its own. Taiwan opts for more missiles and nuclear bombs. The nervous Russia shifts nuclear and conventional forces for defense against global rivals. China and Japan, India, both China, depends on its nuclear forces and do likewise. In Asia, raised nukes into high gear. No wonder what one former U.S. official helped guide North Korea policy warns of a new domino effect in Asia. And 2, the race will extend to India and Pakistan. This is Business Week in 2003. But if Japan decides to build its own nukes, get ready for an age race. China would likely want to boost its arsenal into developing more nuclear weapons, which would spur Pakistan to do the same, and on until in our future and subcontinent will kill Earth. This is counted in 2002. Pakistani nuclear weapons could trigger a chain event. An ancient enemy could respond in kind. China's India's hand could react if India, under her nuclear weapons, triggered a nuclear holocaust on the subcontinent. Any of either Russia or America were launched either accidentally or purposely in response. Nuclear winter would ensue, meaning on Earth. And also relations are power projection. This is Kazuki 99. First, the United States cannot maintain global presence with Japan. First point is obvious that Japan's unique role as America's power projection platform. U.S. military bases and all another allied bases for responding to specific regional threats. And also, this DA proves that impacts happen. They're not going to actually gain. Global modeling can link back to solvency at the point that they don't spread everywhere. And then next, enigmas. The Bush space plan will pass in the status quo. So President George W. Bush attempted to turn the United States back in the direction of Mars in 1989 speech. The proposal never took hold because Congress did not see the value in investing heavily in the space of the administration proposes encourages presidents. Group says the first president was able to convince the nation that the country needs to be a preeminent spacefaring nation because it's about exploring the frontier and what great do. And B links first the political capital needed Bush's space in 2004. Bush's proposal will face first will be whether Bush can persuade Congress to appropriate money to the process towards a new lunar or Mars mission. Second, the plan would erode Bush's accounts in 2002. The oceans have also suffered from political indifference. Making progress would require Mr. Bush to do things he has no uptime for, such as starting funding regional institutions that failed, risking political capital to constitute developers. And C, the impacts. First, the space plan is critical to survival. Each increase risks everything. This is felt in 2003. The lack of space program will get us all killed. Homo sapiens as the sapiens are actually. A well-conceived program may be our only hope for long-term survival. The right or wrong decisions about space research and exploration may be key to the future's great-grandchildren. And second, everything really is at risk. The choices we make now are key. Aerospace America in 2003. The U.S. Congress must decide if it truly wishes to continue the human exploration of space. For years, we have watched budget forcing NASA to beg little from one program, borrow funds from the other, until third to keep the program going. We must take a hard look at what funding is required to keep the endeavor alive. This agency can develop a vehicle for the next generation, support the upgrades of the current one, to the launchers build big marbles and send everyone home. Bush is that we need environmental movements of toothless in the base of Bush's assault on natural resources. Offer in 2002 may be on their side, but working to protect the environment sure doesn't seem to have many other friends in high places right now. The Bush administration's rampant assault on worldwide regulations that firmly offers some safeguards rights reunition of the look in the current climate. And B links plan is a major win for the mainstream movements and death help for grassroots environmental focus on environmental issues hijacks the environmental moving forces hegemonic institutions to achieve at 94. An expression of the universal landism or about planetary is left the people, including poor of the world or the planet, are not at the center of all three. You have to look at the fact they're claiming U.S. hegemony as an impact. They're trying to get U.S. leadership throughout this. And C, impact. It's try or die for the negative. 1, reformism. Stop GIP, peace, mortality. I can't say for the this is rule to the task of developing an ecological, sustainable society is a major challenge facing current social institutions. However, the results achieved so far fancy, faster, safe, more grass. Although there's been incremental progress in reversing global pollution, it pales comparison to changes that are losing the struggle to reverse ecological degradation. The evidence from this is far beyond question. And grassroots movement key to solve environmental destruction. Failure to allow grassroots action precludes alleviation of environmental destruction. This is Charles in 1990. Modern society has, for the most part, failed to get the enormous way that can help prevent and cure environmental hurts. Conscientious lifestyles. The time is ripe to unleash individual responsibility. Society as a whole tends to discount personal caring and willingly that don't care or care about things that they affect them directly. Nothing could be further from the truth. Despite others, most people want to make a difference. The environmental movement has not adequately drawn the connection.
Okay, first I'm going to talk about your topicality. What word are we violating, actually?
Federal government.
Okay, so we're not using the United States federal government?
actually, whenever you're, what we're claiming, 200-mile EEZ zone is abusive on Topicality.
So how is that a topicality? How is that not used in the federal government?
The United States, according to the United.
So okay, that's cool. That's okay. So we're talking about violations of the United States.
Sorry, it's not.
All right.
It's the United States.
Okay. All right. On this this ad Japan.
Yes.
Could you tell me the tag on the uniqueness card real quick?
Sure, it's that Japan is an ocean leader.
And didn't the card actually talk about Japan's supercomputers?
Yes, but we can have further extensions that's talking about it.
Okay,
But it
so
just used
but
that
this particular
no, but it
uniqueness
just used
card
that
is just about
example.
technology.
It just used that example to show how Japan, in fact, is the leader.
Leader in what?
It says Japan's Marine Science and Technology Center. So
So it's about the all right. That's cool. I didn't hear that part. All right. How does our plan somehow real quick between?
on the Japan one.
Yes, on Japan.
It's loss of soft power triggers militarism.
No. Okay. I guess the link then. How are we causing that loss?
What our link is that influences that your plan upstages Japan, because right now Japan is an ocean leader, but whenever
Okay,
your
how
plan
is,
whenever your plan is enacted, you're claiming that U.S. will even increase in power, and that U.S. can actually transport this power to other countries.
That's going to anger Japan.
Yes.
Okay. And so it's losing Japan's soft power is what the DA is about.
Yeah, it's just
Okay.
it's going to anger
So our
Japan.
plan's going to hurt soft power. All right. On this grassroots movement, who's to say our plan is a mainstream activism plan instead of a grassroots activism plan?
Well, wait, what?
Why is our plan
Oh,
from the
because-
mainstream environmental movements instead of the grassroots movements? Like,
Because-
what's the difference?
Because yours is mainstream at the point that that you're having the actual
That it
government
might
do
get
it.
passed?
No, at the point that the United States federal government.
So the point of an activism movement is not to get legislation passed?
What we're saying is that your plan is bad because it's going to hurt the environmental issues, which the grassroots and
By
society
being a
in general
mainstream
is
plan,
doing
by
it.
being a mainstream environmental movement, right?
Yes, because we're
So
saying
why
that.
so it's a mainstream environmental movement because it's going through the government, right?
Yes.
So the grassroots activism are not trying to get legislation passed? They're not
No.
trying to get things changed?
No, what we're saying is that the grassroots can be able to do all of this stuff on
Okay,
their
so
own,
if
but
the
as soon as you
grassroots-
do this, they're not going to be able to solve it. Our
All right,
last card is
thank
talking about how.
You take a little bit of break. All right. The order is going to be a little bit of debate theory on top. You can float on a separate piece of paper if you like. Then we're going to go to the topicality of the United States, this Japan disadvantage, the Bush disadvantage, and finally the movement's disadvantage. Judges already? Okay, first of all, we're going to start off with pulling through the fact that they dropped every aspect of our case. They dropped solvency, harms, and both of it the advantages. At this point, you're going to have to realize that they should not be able to bring these up, even through their next constructives of the following rebuttals. The reason for this is going to be that it provides too much burden on the 1AR. They need to provide all of their cases prima facie, just as the affirmative team does, because it's reciprocal, and because it's simply good debating form in order to present all of your arguments at the beginning of a speech. Because of this, don't let them bring up any new cases. Don't let them try to bring up any case arguments through the following speeches, especially through the next couple of speeches, if they didn't bring it up in the 1 and C. But now let's go into the arguments they did bring up in the 1 and C, the topicality of the United States. First of all, they define what the national jurisdiction is throughout the boundary waters, but that's not defined what the United States is. In fact, all this does is define necessarily what our ocean boundaries are. So they never gave, first of all, a definition of the United States, so they don't necessarily have a clear interpretation of what this topicality is. Secondly, we're going to go ahead and define ocean, because that's due to dictionary.com 2003, that's the entire body of salt water that covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface. The resolution says the United States federal government should establish an ocean policy. Therefore, it says the United States federal government, the three branches of the government that we have that's commonly accepted that they never defined, is actually should just have a policy that talks about the entire body of salt water that covers up to more than 70% of the Earth's surface. What actually happens is the resolution says that the United States is the actor. It's not necessarily the boundaries, but it says the resolution says we must use a policy that goes throughout the entire ocean. The resolution mandates this by definition. Next, go on to their standards. First of all, on the counter standards on the resolution, we meet this entire body. First of all, we meet this because we do affect the entire body of salt water that covers 70% of the Earth's surface. We affect every place where Calorbia texifolia will ever exist. But next, counter standards. First of all, this is a dictionary definition that's best for debate because it provides a stable definition. Also, common man. At the point where we define what an ocean is, and it's the commonly accepted definition. And also, it sets the best limits in the round because it's grammatically correct, and grammatical context is the best way to evaluate the debate round. Now, go on to their standards. First of all, these are not standards at all. These are extra voting issues. None of them actually talk about why their definition is preferential. All of them talk about how education, fairness, grounded abuse are all important for this debate round. None of them talk about why their definition is preferential to any interpretation whatsoever. Maybe that's because they didn't have an interpretation in the first place. And also, their voting issues that they actually claim are tradition and jurisdiction. First of all, the only reason they give you the topicality as a voter is because topicality's always been a voter. Well, tradition is not necessarily a good voter at the point where it doesn't prove any in-round abuse. And the argument where they said they're going to have harms cards later on, but where they have specific links and disadvantages to our case, this proves the abuse is never here. And you shouldn't vote on topicality simply because it's topicality. The final argument on this is the international law of the sea actually obligates the United States to eliminate calorific This is from Global Security in 2002. The ability to move U.S. forces when and where they are needed depends on the unedited access to the world's oceans and international airspace. To ensure access is a matter of legal right, the U.S. Naval Force in 1987 conducted more than 20 operations to protest excessive maritime claims and supported the President's Freedom Navigation Program. These assertions supported the U.S. foreign policy of adherence by all nations to the international law of the sea, which the United States has signed. On to the Japan counterplan. First of all, the United States has an obligation to be the leader in moral and environmental policies because the opportunity, the most influential, and have the greatest impact on other countries. This is from Yost, 1991. Leadership is the environmental sector, an important obligation. There are steps the United States should take to mobilize the world community to deal with the global problems we all share. Next, this disadvantage of environmental leadership is kept in global environments. From National Commission on the Environment in 1993. The development and use of the environmental sector, superior technology, getting prices right, environmental literacy, and getting for the sustainable key are the components of a sustainable future for the United States. However, putting our own house in order is not enough. The environmental institutions and political economies are all at stake for the major UN sectors to protect the global environment. Next will follow. The United States leadership is critical and gets much internationally. This is from the Commission on the Environment in 1993. The United States is the vital and world sustainability is the dominant world power, including because historically it's been a leader in environmental policy. With that, for the rest of the world, respect democracy and democracy also served in many ways environmental problems. The United States, it's non-unique. The United States is already pursuing in 2002. Multilateral arrangements can be especially useful in government. Unfortunately, the United States has been able to emitters of greenhouse gases and potentially catastrophic challenge to global warming. Although the United States conducts the protocol in 1998, the Senate has staunchly opposed its ratification in March 2001, repudiating the protocol. This actually leads to global free riding, which crushes U.S. leadership by U.S. national defense for the 21st century in 2002. Networks of economic energy states so much added deal with some functional levels beyond the investments the private sector puts on the stage, which provide military security to assure stability. Next was Japan, and analytical on their link. They plan at stages Japan, but at the point where Japan cannot supply our argument from the one that says we can go in and act on this plan because sea slugs are only found within the EEZ. The United Japan will never be able to act on it. They also talk about their link that says that the loss of soft power is actually not an issue at all. Talking about my part of knowledge, not dealing with ocean policies whatsoever. First of all, a prelude to this is that this plan this relies completely on the fact that political plan erodes political capital. But I want you to cross-apply this best. All they say is that ocean policies in general, our plan is bipartisan. The control of exotic species in the water by the Coast Guard has bipartisan in 2000. Bipartisan before. There's a future consensus for legislation. There's some nations who want enforceable regulatory, want no possibility, man compromise approach, rating maritime partisan issues, and nature conservatory. In 2001. Numerous international and non-binding have been developed to deal with certain aspects of threat. The most comprehensive 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity, which calls on all parties 100,000 prevented the introduction of control or eradicate this alien species with the government ecosystems, habitats, or species. Winners win. This is always true. It's federal government, especially when we deal with our plan. We have evidence on this later on, but because of the popularity of the plan, it prevents the loss of capital that happens. And due to this, that takes out the interest. Simply, the specificity good on the movement's disadvantage. First of all, no link. The plan is not perceived because industry and pressure groups, including lobbyist groups, are not in MENAs in 1999. The algal invasion, the question on one hand, the scientific problem being complex, propaganda, and solving habitats that major members of the associations never saw. The radicals and equal politicians had little interest, no well-defined adversaries, political misdeeds. Next, the link. Bush corporations will crush the environment. The plan cannot, because Bush gave up on Borrelius and Lavelle in 2000. Democratic hopefuls assailed the Republican administration said wholesale rollback environmental regulation. This was most an environmental administration in our history, much worse than the first President Bush. Next, mainstream movements are actually trying to give people attention. Things would rather ignore. Casting 1997. According to the rise of the Greens can be attributed to a civilizational shift in humans by paying attention to what supports not a threat. We are so many people the Greens are doing is trying to give people attention. Encourage allies doesn't even deny. Next, failed. They do not solve. The local grassroots movements are fragmented or any chance of saber crop. However, the grassroots movements have been more isolated guerrilla unit war. The grassroots movements are fragmented. Their efforts uncoordinated. The national organizations provide little assistance to the groups and ceased to. Next, first of all, the Russian grassroots movement, because the goal is actually what this from Cheers in 1990. Continue to hold the line against congressional backing. We need to improve the environmental legislation and federal ensure they are enforcing existing laws. And with that, I'm open to cross-examination.
I see your interpretation of UIL, and so can I see your politics? Actually, can I just see it all?
Okay, I don't have it written down.
Just whatever evidence and your interpretation on topicality.
Okay, I read. the Japan dishead cards that I read. Finally, Topicality interpretation.
Here, let's see.
Okay, for the counter definition, for the counter definition, first is definition, and that proves that it's the most stable, contains the most stable definition.
What else?
Second, I said it's a common man definition because it's commonly used. That it has.
What makes it a common? Like, how do you know that it's a common man?
It's the common definition of ocean spans of water. It's the fact that it's not common man if you wish, but it's the definition of what an ocean is.
Okay.
And then the final standard I had was limits because grammatically.
And also, you said on your Japan, or you said that the U.S. is the only one who could do the plan about how multilateral policies crush other nations. Could you have?
I didn't say that multilateral policies crush other multilateral policies. In the long writing, which crushes U.S. leadership by shouldering
Will you
other
explain
nations.
it, please?
Yeah, this card talks about how when multilateral action gets taken to a too far sense, if we have to take into account every problem that every nation could have, then this leads to the shouldering of other nations when it deals with our environmental policies. If we take too many multilateral actions, then what we're saying is that we're going to be nations. This card only works when it's coupled with the fact that the United States is the only one able to solve. If we have to go into a multilateral policy in which we're the only one doing work, then leads to global.
And why was the U.S. the only one who could solve?
Japan can't get Florida sea slugs because they don't have Florida.
Okay. And on to the politics.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, you said that, what was the first argument, that ocean has bipartisan support of this?
I read this.
Did you read both?
My pretext to this was that your entire disadvantage relies on the fact that political capital gets sapped. But due to the specificity of your arguments,
Do you use the Coast Guard in your plan?
the Coast Guard is how the ANSCF enforces
And
this.
so that's how they do it. Use.
Well, the Coast Guard is the only one who'll be able to
Okay.
transport. You want me to finish answering the question? Okay.
Do you prep one? Yes, please. I'm going to go topicality and then environmental movements. Is everyone ready? Okay. First of all, on the topicality, you're going to look, they said that they don't define the United States, we only define the ocean boundaries, but when you look at the definition, when you look at the resolution in a whole, you're going to look at the ocean policy, that the United States only has jurisdiction over the EEZ, which is 200 miles around the coast of the United States. At that point, you look at the resolution contextually, and you see that the only way that they can enact their plan is if they enact it within the EEZ and nowhere else. They can only enact it within the EEZ. So this defines the resolution contextually. It defines the United States ocean policy, United States federal government enforcing this ocean policy, and they can only do it within the EEZ. To their ocean is the entire body of water. You group this and you group the answers. Fine. They do affect the entire body of water, but they can't do that. They can only affect the EEZ. And when you look at the resolution as a whole contextually, you can only solve within the United States as a whole. Extend across our definitions. The EEZ is 200 miles out, and that's the only place in the United States has jurisdiction. And then you skip down to their standards, or their counter standards. First, they give you dictionary definition. But just because their definition is a dictionary definition and it's common man doesn't mean that it's correct. You look to our definition first because it's a person in the field is an actual professor. It's someone in the field, and you're going to vote here first. Next, they said that they set the best lakes below the ground in the round is completely abusive to the Navy solve internationally. They solve without the United States to actually do the plan. In order for their plan to actually work, and it looks to their card that they said law of the sea actually forces us to solve. No, you would have to actually have some kind of consulting other countries in order to do this. The United States can only solve within the United States. They can't solve for other countries. If they try to solve with other countries, they would have to consult first or something. They can't solve outside of the United States jurisdiction in another country's jurisdiction. It's completely abusive, and it's not possible. And also, looking down our standards, they say that group all of our standards, and they said that they're just extra voters, but that's not true. Actually, education is a standard for education. First, actually increased education. We show that the United States can only be solved EEZ, and at this point, we increase education because around they decrease education. You vote education because we prove to you that they can only at that point you vote for us because it's that we increase education, we increase fairness, and we increase ground in the round. We make it completely fair because the affirmative plan explodes their ground. Again, it's the same argument I made on limits. They completely explode the ground, and it's not fair to the affirmative team or to the negative team. And the in-round abuse, they say we provide no in-round abuse, but if you look, we provided no specific case cards to the no specific case cards. So at that point, you see that there is in-round abuse, and you vote them down on this for the reasons of tradition and jurisdiction. They say that you're not going to vote on tradition because it's not a good voter. It provides, and we provide no in-round abuse. But yes, tradition is a voter. There's a reason the topicality is always the prima facie that you look at in the round. Traditionally, it's a voting issue, and it's before we look at anything else straight across because they don't answer that back. You have the ability to vote, and so you will. So you're going to vote on topicality. And next, on to environmental movements. Okay, first of all, they tell you no link, that the plan isn't going to be perceived, so they're not going to. So the groups aren't actually going to get involved. But if you extend across our second link, that the focus on Bush's environmental policy kills environmental movements, because the focus is going to be on Bush's policy. And then second, the environmentalists are significantly influencing the status quo. Beth Daly in 2001, as Greenpeace celebrates its 30th birthday this year, President George W. Bush by such steps, membership is increasing, and East Coast protest tour is underway. It becomes more difficult to ignore as they hire more. So as you can see, the actually the status quo. They are using the status quo, and the grassroots movements are going to be able to do a plan. And also, the movements are necessary to inform the public. Without information on the environment, citizens can't make informed decisions. This is Shavecroft in 2000. From an educated citizenry cannot make informed environmental choices if it lacks the information to do so. As Conrad of Dartmouth College observes, it's the role of the environmentalists to articulate the issues clearly, but they also must be able to deliver the message, and the principal way of doing so is to the audience beyond their own members in through mass media, television, radio waves, newspapers, the internet. With media having newer organizations, the ability of the environmental movement to present its message to the public is steadily increasing. So as you can see, the environmental movements are going to be perceived. They can talk to the public as the federal government cannot, and so there is a link because the plan is going to be perceived. And then moving down, he says it's non-unique and that we overwhelm uniqueness group those two. They say that the mainstream movements are actually increasing, but they aren't increasing with environmental policies. Environmental policies aren't increasing, and they never prove you that. Non-unique to DISAD, because the DISAD actually talks about moving down. They say that the movement is fragmented and unorganized, but this isn't true. First, grassroots environmentalist movements are large and growing. Shavecroft in 2000. Grassroots organizations are another matter. Their members tend to be intensely involved in their local issues because often their health or the health of their families and their property are immediately at risk. There are no reliable estimates of the number of grassroots organizations and their memberships. Lewis Gibbs, organizer of the Love Canal Citizens Committee, works with a network of some 8,000 to 9,000 local groups with memberships ranging from half a dozen activists to several hundred. Undoubtedly, many more local groups with some focus on the environment. And next, activist groups are well established. This is Switzer in 2003. Variously, the mainstream groups are described as the Group 10 or Group 12. They are distinguished from the other national groups because of their lobbying activities, and they represent the most important sources of influence and membership. These groups are enduring, and they have established membership base, expertise, financial resources, and a track record in Washington. So as you can see, the grassroots are going to be able to solve. But at the point that they actually pass a legislative policy, they destroy the grassroots movement. When they destroy the grassroots, the impacts happen. For the grassroots movements is they actually are environmental destruction. And at the point that they don't allow the grassroots movements to solve, they actually increase environmental destruction because you see that the government policies are not actually going to solve. And then moving down to their next argument, they say that victories aren't going to hurt. They aren't going to hurt the actual goal is legislation. It's movement goals or legislation. But to the shell, extend across the shell, it shows that the victories actually destroy the grassroots movements. Yes, the grassroots movement's goal is actually legislation, but the grassroots movement have to get recognition for that legislation to keep going on. At the point that they don't get recognition and the federal government gets the recognition, then it kills the grassroots movement. Also, some empirically gains for mainstream movements come at the expense of the grassroots movement. Snow in 1992. Conservation leaders at all levels perceive a gulf between the large institutionally stable organizations on the international national science scene and the grassroots groups will state local and regional levels. Organizational isolation within which many leaders decry has an enormous impact on the issues as well as the people involved. For the gulf between national and local environmental advocates has everything to do with a perceived lack of effective advocacy. Environmentalists often fail to muster the critical mass needed to move important issues. As a result, local activists feel increasingly undercut and undervalued. The self-described as street fights complain that the mainstream is actually represent no one but themselves. So as you can see, that the grassroots movements actually represent the people's choice, what the people want. What the people want is environmental protection. But they aren't going to get this unless you allow the grassroots movements to solve. And their final argument, they say that the grassroots movements aren't going to give up because of the plan, but you're not going to accept this because it has no warrants. They don't finish in the round. This is why they won't accept. So you scratch that card off your ticket in the round. And so, when you look back at the round, first, right now, first you're going to see that they aren't topical. You're going to vote them down because they aren't topical. They don't. They enact their plan outside of the EEZ, and they can't possibly do that because when you look at our evidence, it proves that they can only enact within the EEZ. United States only has jurisdiction within the EEZ. They don't give any other country to act outside that. So you're going to look to our definition over theirs, and then you're going to look to our voters, and you're going to see topicality is a reason that you're going to vote them down. Then you move to the environmental movements, and environmental movements are the only way that you can solve structuring the status quo. So actually, it's going to completely turn their affirmative plan because it's going to destroy any environmental action attempted now in the status quo, and it's going to destroy any environmental policy. And I now
Judges already? Okay, I want to talk about your topicality for a little. So basically what you're saying is that we violate the jurisdiction of the other countries by exiting our own EEZ?
Yeah, the United States doesn't have jurisdiction to go outside the EEZ without the permission of the other countries or without actually working with the other countries.
Okay, how does this prove that we're not within the resolution?
Because within the resolution says the United States must enact an ocean policy.
If the United States enacts an ocean policy on its own, then it's going to be within the EEZ. That's the intent of the resolution.
Okay, so if the United States enacts an ocean policy that does not deal with its EEZ, it simply makes it not an ocean policy?
Well, because you're dealing with areas outside of the EEZ, it's completely abusive to the to the negative team, sorry, and that's the reason that it's not resolutionally correct.
Okay, so it's an abuse, not a resolutional.
Well, the fact is the resolution actually, the intent of the resolution is for you to plan within the EEZ, and when you don't, it's abusive.
Okay. So the United States signed the international law, the jurisdiction to go into other countries, but get the obligation to go to international waters when there's a problem. How is the United States still violating these international?
Because under the resolution, it has to be United States ocean policy. In EEZ.
Okay. Let's talk about your movements. Which specific movements are in the ocean?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so no one's actually destroyed.
No, the environmental policies. And when they're
Is
pushing
any movement pushing for this policy?
I'm not sure.
Okay. You talk about how the government does not have the ability to talk to the public, and the grassroots movement does.
Mhm.
If the government enacts a policy, then how can it communicate that this policy has even happened? How can the grassroots movement's perception change if the government can't communicate?
I don't understand what you're asking.
You read a card talking about the reason why grassroots movements are more effective is because they're able to communicate with the public, and the federal government cannot.
Mhm.
If the federal government can't communicate which policies are happening to the public, they can't communicate their goals and policies to the public, how can we say that grassroots movements are going to be hurt in the long run? How can the public's perception of these even change?
I still don't understand what you're asking.
Yeah, okay, we'll just talk about it in 1 hour. And then on the last card, you say that because I didn't finish the card, that means that we just scratch it off.
Well, there were no warrants to the actual tag claim. Like, you hadn't read them yet, and so there's no reason to
Okay, so
accept
the
tag
part
for
of the
this.
card that I read just go.
Well, you didn't give any warrants to the actual tag, so they can't be accepted.
Okay, and then you talk about how you talk about they're growing. If groups get too large, doesn't this make them large-scale movements?
No, movement is legislation by the United States federal government.
Is that always the instance? Is that
That's-
always what a mainstream movement does?
That's what the mainstream movement in this instance is.
In this instance, is.
Yes, it's a policy passed by the federal government.
Okay, that's all I have.
Okay, I'm going Japan and then politics. Is everybody ready? Okay, first across the non-unique, the DA is non-unique, therefore whatsoever. Okay, moving on to politics. Okay, their first argument is that they said that ours is just our linked scenario is just general linked scenario and that it doesn't specifically link to them. But at the point that their political capital, and I've said specifically that legislation will take political capital, then it clearly links to them. Also, environmental protection costs political capital. The St. Petersburg Times in 2001. The time is quite appropriate for a comprehensive policy uniting energy, environmental, and economic issues that would solve several of America's ills and accomplish some of what the president said he would do. Campaign trail, the president's solution to America's untiable thirst for energy is also struggling with several environmental issues that have costs. So their claim environmental protection they're using is going to prove that they actually do, in fact, take political capital. And next, they said that their plan, that they said that they have bipartisan support, but if you look within that evidence, it talks about how different parties want different things. It says some parties want voluntary measures, want mandatory regulation. Nowhere in that card actually claim that they do have, doesn't even claim that environmental movements have bipartisan support. And not only that, but it doesn't even say that their plan has bipartisan support. So they're completely overtagging that card, and thus they have no warrant to that. And then their second argument that fighting invasive species is a bipartisan issue. Also, if you look within that card, it talked about how the Clinton administration showed strong leadership on the issue, but nowhere on the card whatsoever. And as you all know, Bush is our president now. So not only is it not within the presidency that we have right now, but it doesn't even say that fighting invasive species is a bipartisan issue within that card. It just talks about Clinton administration having leadership. And then off their third arguments, they gave winners win. But first of all, you're going to have to look at the fact that they have absolutely no evidence on that whatsoever. It was just an analytic, and thus they have no warrants whatsoever. But the negative winning doesn't help with future fights. This is Shake in 2000. One Trump does make a presidency. One Trump does not make a presidency, nor does it ensue that an early success will last. Every year is a new budgetary battle for the president, fresh opportunities to get Congress to do his bidding, and no follow successes. Shake in 2000. Even with the president has early budget successes, follow victories may be difficult to choose up political goodwill when they vote for spending cuts, as occurred in 1981, or for tax increases, as occurred a dozen years later. So that proved that, in fact, winners don't always win, and you have that to weigh against them not having any evidence whatsoever. And also, just an extension on uniqueness. This is from Universe Today in March 11th, 2004. On January 14th, 2003, President Bush announced a new vision for NASA and the nation's space program. And just last month, the President's FY 2005 bill was released to strengthen NASA's vision for Mars exploration over the next decade and beyond. NASA's comprehensive robotic approach to exploring Mars and learning the intricacies of environment will not only seek to achieve the science goals outlined in the testimony, will also serve as a solid foundation for the President's vision of eventually conducting a human exploration mission to Mars. So that evidence right there proves that Bush, in fact, does have a comprehensive policy, which is going to go into effect right now to the status quo. And then to move on to our impacts. First of all, they pretty much conceded the impact to us at the point that they never how our story doesn't work, and the point that they never told you how they're not going to in fact lead to the impacts. So you have to buy back the impacts. And the first one was talking about how the space program is critical survival and each decreased risk everything. Within that piece of evidence, it talks about how without the space program, we wouldn't know about large ozone holes, we wouldn't know about the path of killer hurricanes, we wouldn't have communication with the world. So not only would it hurt the way that Americans live right now by not having the space program, you look to our second piece of our second impact that says that everything really is at risk. The choices we make now are key. So this actually provides a time frame for it at the point that it says right now every choice we make is key, and it does in fact matter right now. And also, so at the point that it's also it claims the first impact argument talks about how it's going to eventually lead to extinction, because the space program lets us know about all different things that could in fact cause the world to go into extinction, such as bad things that are going on within the environment and stuff. So obviously that can outweigh any impacts whatsoever that the affirmative can possibly claim coming out. And also, space exploration is critical to U.S. leadership in the short term. We could be surpassed by China and Europe at any point. McClatchy in 2004. It's time to do something different if we want to lead in space exploration. Lewis said, going to the moon and Mars is expensive and risky. We've said before and not met them. What makes this time different is that we have competition with space exploration from China and Europe. Being passed by one of these countries would damage U.S. prestige. So even that impact right there proves how if you enact their plan, U.S. is going to lose its hegemony, it's going to lose its prestige, and they're actually not able to gain their plan once again, because at the point that other countries won't be doing it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Start with topicality. We'll go to the environmental movements DA, and then on to the politics DA. Judges ready? Opponents? John? Okay, first off on the topicality here, they ignore the fact that we came up here and said that the U.S. federal government in the resolution is the actor, not the boundary of the actual resolution. And that's why it says the U.S. federal government should establish a policy. They're the actor, not the boundary on what the policy could be. They basically ignored that argument. But also, I'd like you to look down at the standard debate. Every time that they say, this is why you should vote for us, it is not a standard, it's a voter. A standard is where you say why one interpretation is better than the opponent's interpretation. They don't have any of, all they did was talk about why that topicality is a voter. They said education, well, if you increase education, then you should vote for topicality. But that doesn't turn it into a standard, but I'll go ahead and talk about our standards real quick. They said that the dictionary definition, common man definition, isn't necessarily better because it doesn't look at the entire resolution, but it does look at regardless of the entire resolution, the U.S. federal government is the actor. It looks at the entire how all the rest of the words enact on how all the rest of the words augment this word in the resolution, because the only way they change it is to say U.S. federal government is an actor, not a boundary. And they completely ignore that fact. So the dictionary definition is perfectly fine. Also, the ocean, there's no reason to believe that the EEZ is the only place we can work in the resolution. There's nothing that says that in the resolution. No reason to believe that. She just somehow extrapolated it out of nowhere. And that's why she says the dictionary definition is not better. She actually had no standards in here. And without standards, you have to completely drop the T. But also, she ignored the fact that they're misconstruing the definition of U.S. They're saying the U.S. is the boundary, not the actor. And I'd like you to bring across the partner's analysis about how it's the actor. On the environmental dissent, My opponents dropped my partner's argument about how their uniqueness overwhelms the link. Actually, what they did was they tried to group it into a large group of responses, but the response didn't apply to it. The uniqueness overwhelms the link because Bush has already done too much damage to the environmental policies and to the grassroots movements by trying to push through environmental policies. It's too far to pull it back from. Their uniqueness card is, I guess you would say, too good. It overwhelms their link completely. But also, they talk about how they link specifically to us, but they don't link because it doesn't have any effect on the influence on the status quo because no one is pushing right now for our plan. And there's no grassroots movement pushing for our plan. There's no grassroots movement to be destroyed by pushing this environmental policy through. If the grassroots is all about individuals, i.e. fragmented. She's trying to say that grassroots are a large group and will solve because they're a large group, but even if it is a large group, it's all about single individuals pulling in their own personal way, their own personal direction. It's not well organized. It's not organized well enough to solve, which is what my partner's argument was. I bring that across because their answer to it really didn't answer. And also, like, you cross-apply the card that says only the U.S. can solve. So even if these grassroots movements were doing well, they couldn't solve because they can't access the Elysia Subordinata in the first place. And since there's no grassroots movement to be destroyed, and since even if there was, our plan doesn't have any influence on the status quo because no one's pushing for our plan, then there's really no problem. There's no impact in this disad, and there's also no link because of the uniqueness. Onto the other disad, the disad about political capital. Every single one of their link cards assumes that Bush must force through the plan. But if Bush is not going to be forced through the plan because the plan is a bipartisan, parties like it. I like to cross-apply the evidence that does talk about the Clinton regime, because in the Clinton regime it talks about how it's empirically proven that both parties like legislation that prohibits invasive species. Both parties support this kind of legislation, regardless of whether it was in the Clinton administration or not. It's about the senators, it's about the Congress, it's about the party's affiliations. It's not about who was president at the time. So if it's a bipartisan plan, if Bush is not going to have to force it through, then none of this entire disad doesn't link because he's not using his political capital. Also, on the winner's win, we did extrapolate that argument, but here's some evidence for it. The winner's win is this win for Bush gives him confidence to fend off Hawks with his own party. Ornstein, 2001. The best plan is to pick off two significant priorities, things that can move relatively quickly. In an ideal world, one of them is going to be a little bit tough, where it's a battle, where you've got to fight, but then your victory is all sweeter. The other matter is you can sweep through fairly quickly with a broad base of support to show that you're a winner and can accomplish something. That's just talking about how after you get one strong, tough piece of legislation through, it's just even going to build your capital more, even if you had to use capital to do so, because winners win in the American government. And there's your evidence for you. But on this case, I'd like to point out that they don't even link to us anyway, because it is a bipartisan plan, and it's empirically proven that both the Democratic and Republican parties like legislation that takes care of the invasive species problem. And there's no reason to believe they try to say that their cards don't say that, but that's what the cards say. And so the topicality is misconstrued and completely irrelevant. Thank you.
Can we have the
I'm going to go Topicality, ocean policy, and then the Bush space team. Is everyone ready? Okay, first of all, in Topicality, ocean policy, this is the thing that you're going to evaluate first in the round when you're evaluating the round later. First of all, you're going to see that they say that we ignore that the U.S. federal government is actually the actor, not the boundary. But when you look at the resolution in context, United States federal government must enact an ocean policy. When you look at this in context, you see that that ocean policy must be enacted by the federal government, and that the federal government only has jurisdiction 200 miles out. They only have jurisdiction over the EEZ. At that point, that's the only place that the United States can be an actor over. That's the only place that the United States has jurisdiction over. So it's the only place that they can solve for. When the affirmative plan tries to be an international policy, when they try to solve for the Mediterranean Sea, at that point you vote them down because they are not topical in today's debate. Then they said that we have no reason to believe why the EEZ is the only place that we can solve, but yeah, that's actually in our interpretation. In our definition, it proves that international customary law and domestic statutory and presidential pronouncements, the United States can only exercise jurisdiction over the EEZ. So as you can see from our interpretation, from the beginning, we've proven that the EEZ is the only place the United States can act. Then you're going to look down to our violation, that they still only try to act internationally, and they are not topical because they don't affect only within the EEZ. Then you skip down to our standards, and you see these standards are the reason that you evaluate the definition. I want you to extend across all of my arguments on the standards because they go dropped. They say that I only evaluated them as a voter, but this isn't true. I showed you how our definition actually increases education in the round. By proving that we can only act in the EEZ, we increase education in the round because they in fact decrease education by trying to work internationally and by not allowing the affirmative team any direct case arguments. And then fairness, they must be fair in the round. They must actually, their definition must be fair, but their definition isn't fair. We've shown you how their definition actually explodes the topic and explodes round. Extend that argument across because it's not fair. And then you're going to vote for us because of in-round abuse, because we've shown that there is in-round abuse in this round because we have had no direct case arguments and we've shown you how they are not topical. And then you extend across our voters, the tradition and jurisdiction. They dropped both of these in the last speech, so you flow them straight across. These are reasons that you're going to vote in today's debate because you're going to vote for topicality. It's a vote for reasons of tradition. It's a prima facie issue. You're going to vote here because it's always traditionally been a voting issue. It sets the rules of the game. And jurisdiction, you have the ability to vote, so you will. And for these reasons, you're going to vote for topicality first in the round. But if you still don't buy the topicality and you want to look at the actual rest of the debate, that's fine too, because you're going to look straight to the Bush politics DA. Because when you look to the politics DA, you see first that our uniqueness stands strong. They have nothing to take out our uniqueness. Bush currently is going to pass the plan in the status quo. Okay, fine. Then you look down to the link. They say that actually we assume that Bush must force the plan, but the plan is actually bipart. I want you to extend across both of my partners' arguments to these that they only talk about how the bipart card, the first one that they give you, actually talks about how the two parties want different things. It doesn't actually talk about how there's bipartisan support for the plan. And then her second argument on their second card that they say that says Clinton only showed strong support on the issue. Then they come back up and they say, well, no, it shows that both parties support. No, this card never states that both parties support the plan. It never states that both parties support environmental policies. This card actually only states that state and local governments worked together on environmental initiatives during the Clinton administration. It never says anything about bipartisan support. And so you're never going to vote here. At the point that you see that, you see that the affirmative team, or the negative team, has a strong link to the affirmative case. And so they're going to be costing Bush political capital. And then they say, well, no, because winners win. But I want you to extend across my partner's argument that they give you no evidence coming out of that speech, and so you're not going to accept this evidence. But even if you do, they say it gives Bush confidence and that one tough piece of legislation gives him the political capital he needs. But this card, the parts that they read, don't actually say that. They say that a president needs power in order to pass a policy, and if he has power, he can pass that policy. It never says that President Bush has that power in order to pass the policy, and it never says that winners are going to win. So since it never actually gives the warrants behind the tagline, you're not going to accept the card, and you're going to see that the link is actually strong. The plan is going to erode Bush's political capital. When the plan erodes Bush's political capital, then the impacts happen. Because the Bush space plan is key to all survival on Earth. I want you to extend across my partner's arguments on that. That they gave you no analysis on why you would, the Bush space plan would not be key to survival and why their plan actually outweighs. So you're going to extend that across, that the plan is key to survival and each decrease risks everything. We must pass the Bush space plan right now. And also you're going to extend across the impact that says, second, everything really is at risk. The choices we make are key. As soon as you pass the affirmative plan, it's going to happen. That card shows you right there that there is a time frame argument and that the choices we make right now are key to Bush's space plan in the future. We need Bush's space plan now, and if you pass the affirmative plan, we don't get Bush's space plan, and it leads to extinction. And then finally, you look at the card that space exploration is critical to U.S. leadership in the short term. We could be surpassed by China and Europe at any point. There's another time frame argument right there that shows you that you're going to vote negative. And so when you're evaluating the round, you're going to see first that they aren't topical, and then finally, then you're going to look to the DA, and you're going to see that they.
Go ahead and take the 2 minutes. All right, the order is going to be topicality, followed by the disadvantage with a policy underview on the bottom. Is everyone ready? Okay, a couple of big mistakes by the on this topicality. In a brief overview, you have to remember a couple of things. The first of all is that they never said a clear interpretation. This argument goes completely dropped their last speech that they never said a clear interpretation by defining any specific words in the resolution. With this part, when my partner brought it through in the last speech, I brought it up in the 2AC. At the point where they define natural jurisdiction instead of the United States or ocean policy, they never define any words in the resolution, and they set no clear interpretation. The second is their national jurisdiction doesn't take into account the Law of the Sea Treaty, which our partner and I both talked about how the Law of the Sea Treaty actually gives the federal government the ability and the ability and the obligation to go into foreign waters if a threat is posed. This card goes completely dropped. My partner pulled it through beautifully in the last speech, and we talk about how this jurisdiction is expanded through the Law of the Sea Treaty. Those are two reasons why this topicality interpretation simply falls. But now if you go down by the line by line, they say, in context, the U.S. can only be used in the EEZ, but that's by their definition, which doesn't take into account Law of the Sea Treaty or a clear interpretation. They say in context, but they don't set a context. They say in context we have this interpretation. However, in context, they don't have a definition of any specific words in the topicality, not allowing a clear interpretation of the topicality. They want to talk about tradition and rules. How about defining a word that's within the resolution? Now you go on down and you see that there's a couple of actors. Once again, the United States is the actor, not necessarily the boundaries. The United States is the one who enacts an ocean policy. Our ocean policies are allowed to extend due to the Law of the Sea Treaty and it's defining a clear interpretation. And then also, once again, that their standards, once again, every time you hear them say our standards are education, fairness, ground, and abuse, it's a reason why our definition should be voted on. It's not a reason why you compare two interpretations. It's not a reason why this is a natural jurisdiction. It's a reason why the quote-unquote interpretation we've set up is a reason to vote for us. It doesn't necessarily set any reasons why their definition of natural jurisdiction is better than our definition of ocean, which actually is in context when you take into account ocean policy. And once again, the abuse is not there. My partner talked about how their case-specific links, specifically in this Bush disadvantage, how they talk about how political capital would be drained because of our plan. You have to remember that the plan is, that the abuse has simply not been involved in the round. Now go on to the Bush disadvantage. Okay, once again, I don't know what they got on the Ornstein card, but this card doesn't just say that presidents need political capital. I'm going to reread the part of this card that my partner wrote. Every bit of political capital you have to achieve in early victories will both establish you as a winner, because the key to political power is not the formal power you have, your ability to coerce people to do what they otherwise would not do. This is the part of the card my partner read, and it simply says that when you can coerce people to do what they otherwise would not do, this gives you the ability, and it makes you a more persuasive speaker as a president, and it gets more laws passed in the long run. This winner's win card is great, but it also, we extrapolated the winner's win card originally from our argument about how our plan is bipartisan. Now, if you look at the two cards, they've been fighting about these two cards the whole time. However, their arguments in this, first of all, the Coast Guard card talks about how not just the environmental state senators and the political leaders, talks about how the political leaders of both parties and their followers would like to see more environmental changes done by the Coast Guard due to the exotic species. And then the second card talks about how under the Clinton administration, both parties found themselves agreeing on environmental policies when it came to invasive species, which President Bush has not involved himself in at all. Both of these cards prove that whether or not it's dealing with Republican leaders and followers or President Clinton's influence on America once he provided the right plan, which our plan is the same type of plan, then it proves that our plan is bipartisan support. It has support from both parties, and it does not lose any political capital on the front, either because of winners win or, in a different scenario, because the plan is bipartisan and Bush isn't going to be losing any political capital in the first place. Due to these arguments, you cannot vote us down on this disadvantage because the link simply falls. And then once again, pull through the argument that the plan does not erode political capital because of these reasons. Now, due to this argument, you have to weigh the impacts at the end of the round. Voting negative means that you let Colurbia taxifolia run rampant and destroy the ocean for fear of loss of political capital, so President Bush can send us to space. However, if you vote for the affirmative team, then voting affirmative prevents the loss of biodiversity and the loss of international leadership by the United States, and because we can stop the Colurbia taxifolia right now. The biggest mistake through this entire round is that they didn't even make an attempt at arguments. They didn't make any biodiversity arguments, any species arguments, any invasive species arguments about our plan. They didn't attack our harms, inherency, or solvency. And they say they don't have any cards, but I mean, how hard is it to find a biodiversity card? If at the point where we still have both of our huge advantages, both leading to extinction or international relations, which prevents war in the long run, this is going to be the biggest impact in the round. Because we simply do not need, we can enact Bush's space plan, but at the point where we don't have any more biodiversity, we're still extinct in the long run. And at the point where our international agreements not only enhance our plan now, but enhance future plans for environmental protection, then that actually means we're going to be solving for this disad in the long run. Now, what you have to realize is, once again, this comparison of disadvantages